The reign of Nero is filled with scandals, betrayals, and madness. Yet nothing prepared Rome for what was about to unfold. A woman he adored was gone forever, taken by his own violent rage, and grief consumed the emperor like a fire with no end. But instead of letting death close the chapter, Nero chose to reopen it in the most unnatural way. He found a boy fragile, beautiful, hauntingly similar to the wife he had lost, and in that boy, he saw an opportunity to defy fate itself. What followed was not just shocking, it was grotesque, a performance so bizarre that even Rome's decadent history had no equal. The boy would be remade, his life rewritten by an emperor who could not accept reality. And as the city whispered in horror, the question hung heavy in the air. Was this love born of grief, or the madness of a man who believed he could bend the world to his will? Rome was a city built on power, ambition, and blood. Behind the marble walls and golden palaces lay secrets darker than any battlefield. It was here, in the 1st century, that an emperor rose who would become one of the most infamous names in all of history. Nero. To his people, he was not just a ruler but a performer, a man who believed the empire itself was his stage. His reign would be remembered for fire, cruelty, and madness. Yet of all the horrors written about him, none has echoed louder through the centuries than the story of a boy whose life was stolen to satisfy the emperor's grief. This is where history blurs into something stranger than fiction. The moment when Nero castrated a boy to replace his dead wife. Nero's story begins with a mother's ambition. Agrippina the Younger was one of Rome's most ruthless women. From the moment her son was born, she believed he was destined for power. She pushed him into the path of emperors, marrying Emperor Claudius and securing Nero's adoption into the imperial family. When Claudius died under suspicious circumstances, whispers said Agrippina had poisoned him to clear the way for her son. Whether true or not, one thing was certain. At just 17 years old, Nero Claudius Caesar became Emperor of Rome. At first, Rome was enchanted. A boy emperor seemed like a promise of renewal, a break from the brutality of previous rulers. But behind the youthful charm was a man already restless, already lost in a dream of art and performance. Unlike emperors before him, who gloried in conquests and politics, Nero loved music, theater, and poetry. He was less a ruler and more an actor who demanded the world applaud his every line. Among the many relationships in his life, none was more intoxicating than the one he shared with Poppaea Sabina. She was ambitious, beautiful, and dangerously clever. Poppaea was not born to be Nero's wife. She fought her way into that role with cunning and charm. First the mistress of another man, she soon caught the emperor's eye. Nero fell completely under her spell, divorcing and later executing his first wife, Octavia, to make room for her. Rome grumbled at the scandal, but Nero did not care. To him, Poppaea was perfection, his muse, his passion, his queen. But their marriage was far from peaceful. Poppaea knew how to manipulate, and Nero, quick-tempered and insecure, could never control his emotions. Their love was fiery, and like all fires, it could consume everything in its path. One day, during an argument, Nero's rage got the better of him. Accounts differ on the details, but most historians agree. In a fit of anger, he struck Poppaea. She was pregnant at the time, and the blow was fatal. Within moments, the woman Nero adored lay dead, along with their unborn child. For Rome, it was yet another scandal, but for Nero, it was devastation. He had killed the woman he loved most. In his grief, he could not bear the silence she left behind. Yet unlike ordinary men who mourn, Nero was no ordinary man. He was an emperor who believed reality itself could be bent to his will. If Poppaea was gone, he would find a way to bring her back, or, at least, to create the illusion that she had never left. It was then that he noticed a boy named Sporus. Sporus was young, striking, and almost unnaturally beautiful. His delicate features, soft skin, and graceful appearance bore a haunting resemblance to Poppaea. Where others saw a slave boy, Nero saw an opportunity to fill the void in his heart. And with the power of an emperor, his desire became command. Sporus was taken and subjected to a brutal, irreversible act. He was castrated, his body mutilated to prevent him from ever growing into manhood. The purpose was simple and horrifying: to preserve the boy's youthful, feminine beauty, to trap him forever in the form that reminded Nero of the wife he had lost. This was not love. This was obsession turned cruelty, a madness only absolute power could allow. But Nero did not stop there. If Sporus resembled Poppaea, then he would become her. The emperor staged a wedding unlike any Rome had ever seen. In a lavish ceremony, he dressed Sporus in fine garments, draped him in the silks and jewels once worn by an empress, and placed a veil over his head. Before the Roman elite, Nero married him as his bride. He called him Sabina, the same name Poppaea had carried, and introduced him to the empire as though his dead wife had returned to life. The sight must have been surreal. Senators, generals, and nobles forced to stand in silence as the emperor wed a castrated boy, demanding they accept the illusion as truth. To oppose Nero was to invite death, so they played along with the grotesque performance. For Rome, it was another scandal in a reign already overflowing with them. For Nero, it was a triumph, the completion of his twisted play. He had defied death itself. But for Sporus, it was the destruction of everything he had been. Stripped of his body, his name, and his identity, he became a shadow of someone else, a puppet forced to act the part of an empress long dead. He was paraded through the palace, treated with the honors of royalty, but beneath the glittering robes he was still a victim, forced into a life he never chose. His tragedy was that he could never be himself again. He would forever be Poppaea, trapped in Nero's grief-stricken fantasy. Rome was not new to decadence. Emperors before Nero had indulged in excess and scandal. But this act went further than indulgence. It shattered the boundaries of gender, love, and humanity itself. It revealed the dangerous truth of absolute power. When a man commands an empire, even reality bends before him. And as the people of Rome whispered in shock, historians took note. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio would all record this story, not as rumor, but as a testament to Nero's madness. Yet even as Rome reeled, Nero carried on. Sporus, dressed in the robes of an empress, was at his side during public ceremonies. He accompanied the emperor to banquets, to processions, to every corner of imperial life. To the world, he was Sabina, the wife reborn. To Nero, he was proof that the dead could live again if only one dared to remake them. To Sporus, he was nothing but a prisoner on the grandest stage in history. And so the curtain of this strange play rose higher. Nero continued to rule, his extravagance bleeding the empire's wealth, his paranoia silencing all who opposed him. But by his side was always the boy who was no longer a boy, the empress, who was not truly an empress, a living ghost of Poppaea Sabina. This was more than a scandal. It was the embodiment of everything Rome feared about Nero, a man who could not separate grief from obsession, love from cruelty, or fantasy from reality. This was not the end of Sporus' story. His fate, bound so tightly to Nero's, would stretch far beyond this twisted marriage. For Rome itself was changing, rebellions were stirring, enemies were circling, and even the emperor's closest allies were beginning to question how long his madness could last. And when Nero finally fell, Sporus would be forced to live on, carrying the weight of a role he never chose, trapped in the memory of a woman who no longer existed. But before we reach that end, we must understand just how far Nero's delusion would push him, and how the empire itself began to unravel under the weight of his fantasies. For what began as a tragedy of love and loss was only the first act in a drama that would consume them all. The marriage of Nero and Sporus was more than just a grotesque spectacle. It was a mirror of the emperor's unraveling mind. For a time, the illusion satisfied him. Wherever he went, the boy walked beside him, draped in silks, veiled like an empress, and addressed not as Sporus but as Poppaea Sabina. In Nero's eyes, the dead had been reborn, his guilt erased, his passion restored. But for Rome, the sight was chilling. Senators sat through banquets in silence. Nobles forced themselves to bow. Soldiers saluted a boy who was neither man nor woman, neither slave nor free. The whispers spread like wildfire. If this was what the emperor dared to display in public, what horrors took place behind closed doors? Sporus became a ghost in his own skin. Stripped of identity, stripped of choice, he lived only to play the role assigned to him. He was paraded before crowds, adorned in jewels, and treated with the honors of an empress. Yet no title could hide the truth. Beneath the veil, he was still a child, mutilated for another man's obsession. His tragedy lay not only in what was done to him, but in what he was forced to become, a memory in flesh, the shadow of a woman long dead. Nero, however, was not content to stop at this illusion. His reign grew more extravagant, more theatrical. He saw himself as a god among men, not only ruling Rome, but performing for it. He sang on stage, played the lyre before audiences, and demanded applause whether or not he deserved it. Senators, who rolled their eyes, were exiled. Soldiers who mocked him were executed. The empire had become a theater, and its emperor was both star and tyrant. But even the greatest theater cannot silence discontent forever. The people of Rome grew restless. The treasury drained as Nero poured wealth into games, spectacles, and his endless self-indulgence. Taxes soared, corruption spread, and resentment brewed. The great fire of Rome only deepened the hatred. Flames swept across the city, consuming homes, temples, and lives. When the smoke cleared, the people whispered that Nero himself had ordered the fire, standing atop a tower and singing as the city burned. Whether true or not, the rumor was powerful, and it clung to him forever. To deflect blame, Nero accused the Christians, a small and persecuted sect, and unleashed unspeakable cruelties upon them. Men and women were torn apart by beasts in the arena, crucified on crosses, and set ablaze to light the night as human torches. For Rome, it was terror. For Nero, it was another performance. Through it all, Sporus remained at his side. He was there at the feasts, where Nero indulged in excesses so strange they blurred into madness. The emperor hosted banquets where the floors were strewn with flowers, so many that guests nearly suffocated under the weight of petals. He built golden palaces, decorated not for comfort but for spectacle, as if the empire existed only to reflect his own brilliance. And at the emperor's side sat the boy dressed as an empress, silent, obedient, a reminder that even love itself had been twisted into theater. Yet Sporus's presence could not shield Nero from the truth. Power that feeds only on indulgence eventually crumbles, and the cracks in his empire were growing. Rebellions sparked across the provinces. The governors of Gaul, Spain, and Africa murmured against him. Generals once loyal began to question their allegiance. The Senate grumbled in secret, wary of an emperor who played at music while the empire strained under his weight, and the people themselves grew bold. Where once they whispered, now they shouted. Nero's name was cursed in the streets, his image mocked in graffiti that defaced the walls of Rome. Nero's paranoia deepened. He began to see conspiracies everywhere. Friends, advisors, even family members fell under suspicion. His mother, Agrippina, who had once placed the crown on his head, was murdered on his orders when he feared her influence. Seneca, the philosopher, who had guided his youth, was forced to commit suicide under charges of treason. Anyone who threatened his stage, real or imagined, was eliminated, but each death only widened the circle of fear. Trust vanished, loyalty evaporated. The emperor stood increasingly alone, with only his obsessions to comfort him, and through it all Sporus remained a boy without a voice. Bound to the emperor's grief, forced to serve as the wife who could never truly return. To the Roman elite, the sight was humiliating. Their empire, once proud and feared, now bent under the whims of a madman who blurred love with cruelty and politics with performance. To see a castrated boy paraded as empress was not merely scandalous, it was a symbol of decay. Yet still, none dared openly defy him. Absolute power demands silence, and so silence reigned. For a time, but history does not tolerate silence forever. By the year 68, rebellion could no longer be ignored. In the provinces, legions declared their generals. As emperors Galba in Spain, Otho in Lusitania, Vitellius in Germaniol saw opportunity in Rome's chaos. Even the Praetorian Guard, Nero's own protectors, began to waver. They whispered of betrayal, of siding with his enemies for survival. For the first time, the emperor, who once bent reality to his will, found himself facing a truth he could not control. His empire no longer wanted him. When the Senate finally declared him a public enemy, Nero panicked. The emperor who had commanded plays and parades now fled the city in disguise. Abandoning the golden halls where he had ruled as a god, Sporus followed him into the shadows, no longer dressed in finery but still chained to the fate Nero had written. For him, imagine the sight. The Emperor of Rome, once adored, now trembling in exile, surrounded only by a handful of slaves and the boy he had mutilated into a bride. His life had become a parody of the plays he loved except this stage held no audience, and the ending would not be applause. As the armies closed in, Nero's despair grew. He contemplated fleeing to Egypt, ruling as an artist king far from Rome's hatred. But even there, he knew, his enemies would find him. In his final days, he clung to Sporus with a desperation more pathetic than powerful. According to some accounts, he even forced Sporus to rehearse the part of Poppaea one last time, preparing to stage a mock wedding, or perhaps even a mock funeral. In his madness, he could not separate the love he had lost from the boy he had broken. But time was running out. Rome was no longer his stage, and the curtain was about to fall. Cornered, abandoned by the Praetorian Guard, declared an enemy by the Senate, Nero had no choice left but death. Terrified, he begged those around him to take his life, but none would raise the blade. At last, with trembling hands and the help of a servant, he drove a dagger into his throat. His final words, according to legend, were theatrical as ever. "What an artist dies in me." The emperor who had turned life into theater died not with dignity, but with desperation. With him ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and with him began the final descent of Sporus into tragedy. For Sporus, the death of Nero was not freedom. He had lived as a shadow of Poppaea, and now he became a prize to be fought over by Rome's new rulers. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius each rose in turn, and each saw in Sporus something more than a boy. He was a symbol, a possession once held by Nero, and possessing him was a way to prove legitimacy. For Sporus, this meant his life of humiliation and fear was far from over. What began as the fantasy of one emperor would become a curse that haunted him through the reigns of others. The boy who had once been forced to play the role of an empress would find himself trapped in a cycle of cruelty, pushed from one ruler to another, his identity erased again and again. Rome had destroyed him once under Nero. It was not finished yet. The death of Nero should have been the end of Sporus' suffering. The man who had stolen his identity, twisted his body, and bound him to a ghost, was gone. But Rome was not merciful, and freedom did not come. In the vacuum left by Nero, suicide, chaos erupted. Generals and governors vied for power. The Senate scrambled to survive, and the Praetorian Guard shifted loyalties, like gamblers changing bets. And in the midst of this turmoil stood Sporus, fragile boy, neither emperor nor general, but still a figure of strange power, for he carried the memory of Nero, and to possess him was to hold a piece of the last emperor's ghost. Galba was the first to claim the throne, an old man with rigid discipline. He had no patience for Nero's indulgences, no appetite for his theatrics, yet even he could not ignore Sporus. To Galba, the boy was not a lover, not even a person. He was property, a symbol of conquest. If Nero had paraded him as an empress, then Galba's control over him was proof that Nero's legacy was truly dead. Sporus became a curiosity in Galba's court, a silent figure shuffled among new masters, his identity rewritten once again. But Galba's reign was short and brutal. He ruled with cruelty, cutting pensions, stripping soldiers of rewards, alienating the very men who had raised him to power. Within months, Rome turned against him. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, betrayed him in the Forum itself. Galba was cut down in the streets, his severed head paraded on a pike. For most of Rome, it was another violent turn in the cycle of power. For Sporus, it was a reminder. Emperors could die in moments, but he would remain. A prize passed from one victor to the next. Otho followed Galba younger, ambitious, and eager to claim legitimacy. Otho looked upon Sporus with different eyes. Where Galba saw only property, Otho saw opportunity. Otho had once been married to Poppaea Sabina before Nero stole her away. And now, standing before him, was Sporus the boy, forced to play the role of Poppaea, the living echo of the wife he had lost. For Otho, it was as if fate itself had returned his beloved, twisted though the illusion might be. He embraced Sporus not with the coldness of Galba, but with a kind of desperate affection. And so the performance began again. Sporus was dressed as Poppaea once more, adorned with jewels, treated with the honors of a queen. For Rome, it was a bitter irony. The same fantasy Nero had forced upon the boy was now revived under another emperor, this time by the very man who had once been Poppaea's husband. The cycle of cruelty repeated, and Sporus had no choice but to endure. Reign, like Galba's, was brief. Civil war consumed the empire. Vitellius marched from Germania with the strength of legions behind him. The streets of Rome filled with blood as rival soldiers clashed, brothers killing brothers for the promise of a new emperor. Otho, cornered and defeated, chose not to prolong the war. He committed suicide, stabbing himself with a dagger, leaving the empire once more in turmoil. For Sporus, the change of rulers meant another change of fate. Vitellius, coarse and brutal, was nothing like Otho, where Nero had been theatrical and Otho sentimental. Vitellius was cruel in the simplest, most savage way. He had no illusions of love, no fantasies of lost wives. To him, Sporus was not a symbol of affection but of mockery. He represented Nero's madness, and Vitellius intended to use him for one final, cruel performance. Vitellius planned a spectacle, one of the grotesque shows Rome had come to crave. Sporus would be paraded before the crowds, not as an empress, but as a victim. He would be dressed as Persephone, the maiden of Greek myth, dragged into the underworld against her will. And in this performance, Sporus would not merely play a role, he would die. The plan was to release him in the arena. Subjected to violence before a jeering crowd, his death turned into entertainment. His tragedy made into theater one last time. For Sporus, the prospect was unbearable. He had been mutilated, mocked, paraded, and enslaved. He had been made into a symbol of obsession and a trophy of conquest. But to end as a spectacle in the arena, to have his final breath stolen for the amusement of a mob that he could not endure. And so, before the performance could begin, Sporus chose his own end. With quiet defiance, he took his own life. The boy who had once been forced into the role of an empress, who had lived as the shadow of Poppaea Sabina, died not as a spectacle, not as a performance, but in the only act of freedom left to him. His death was not celebrated, not remembered in honor, but whispered as another dark story in Rome's long history of cruelty. Yet Sporus's life remains one of the most haunting tales of the empire. He was neither a soldier nor a statesman, neither emperor nor rebel. Yet his tragedy reflects the corruption of power more vividly than the deeds of kings. In his story, we see the danger of unchecked obsession, the cruelty of absolute rule, and the despair of a soul erased by another's desire. Rome forgot him quickly, as it forgot so many victims of its cruelty. But history remembers. And through history, his voice, silenced in life, is finally heard. The story of Sporus ends not with victory, not with freedom, but with silence. A boy who had been forced to live as someone else, who had been reshaped by the will of emperors, finally chose death over humiliation. His name never appeared in the triumphal arches. No statues were carved in his likeness, and no poets sang of his life. He was forgotten by Rome, absorbed into the endless tide of history. And yet, his tragedy speaks louder than the victories of generals or the boasts of emperors, because Sporus was never truly free, not in life, not in love, not even in death. He was born into a world where the desires of the powerful outweighed the humanity of the powerless. To Nero, he was Poppaea reborn. To Otho, he was a reflection of a lost wife. To Vitellius, he was nothing more than a grotesque joke to entertain the mob, and through it all, Sporus himself vanished, erased beneath the fantasies and cruelties of others. But behind the silks and jewels, beneath the titles and roles forced upon him, there was still a boy who had no say in the course of his own life, a boy who never chose to be the Empress of Rome, who never wished to carry the weight of someone else's ghost. In the quiet moments history has not preserved, we can only imagine what he felt. Did he dream of a simple life, far from the palaces and whispers? Did he wish to walk through the streets not as an object of curiosity but as himself? Did he hope, even for a moment, that someone might see him not as Poppaea, not as a trophy, but as Sporus? His death may have been an act of despair, but in another sense, it was an act of defiance. Rome wanted a spectacle. Vitellius wanted a cruel performance that would reduce him to a symbol of mockery. By taking his own life, Sporus denied them that. He chose the only freedom left to him, the freedom to decide how his story would end. History remembers emperors as larger-than-life figures. Nero, with his madness and theatrics, has been immortalized as one of Rome's great villains. Otho and Vitellius, though short-lived, are preserved in the chronicles of power. But Sporus' story reveals a different side of history, not the grand battles or political triumphs, but the lives shattered beneath them. His tragedy forces us to confront a truth, that behind the glitter of empire, behind the marble of palaces, there are always victims whose voices were silenced. Rome prided itself on greatness, on its legions and its emperors, on its monuments, in its culture, yet in its greatness, it allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. The empire that conquered nations could not protect a boy from the obsessions of a man. The city that claimed to be the heart of civilization could not see the humanity in someone trapped by circumstance. And perhaps that is why the story of Sporus lingers. It exposes the empire's rot, not through its wars or betrayals, but through its indifference to a single human life. Centuries later, historians still debate the details. Some dismiss Sporus as a footnote in Nero's madness, a curiosity mentioned in passing. Others argue that his role, though tragic, reveals the true nature of power in Rome, the way it consumed lives without hesitation. What cannot be debated is the raw cruelty of his existence. His body was mutilated, his identity erased, his life transformed into theater for the amusement of the powerful. And yet, even in that darkness, his story endured. It endured because it is not just about one boy in ancient Rome. It is about what happens when unchecked power strips away the dignity of the weak. Perhaps that is the lesson of Sporus, that empires rise and fall, rulers come and go, but the cruelty inflicted on the powerless should never be forgotten. His life is a reminder that history is not only about the men who wore crowns, but also about those who suffered beneath them. To remember Sporus is to remember the cost of obsession, the price of unchecked desire, and the silence of those who had no voice. Imagine, for a moment, Rome at dusk. The palaces stand tall. The streets echo with the noise of merchants, soldiers, and slaves. Statues of emperors cast long shadows in the fading light. Among them, the name of Sporus is nowhere carved, no legacy left behind. And yet, in that silence, his story survives, not in stone, not in monuments, but in the whispered truth that beneath the grandeur of empire, there was always tragedy. As we look back today, more than 2,000 years later, we do not remember him as Nero's wife, or as Otho's queen, or as Vitellius's mockery. We remember him as a boy caught in the storm of power, a boy who never asked for the role he was forced to play. And in that remembrance, he finally becomes something. Rome never allowed him to be himself. His life was a tragedy, his death a quiet defiance, but his story remains. It reminds us of the fragility of identity, the cruelty of obsession, and the enduring cost of unchecked power. And perhaps, in telling his story now, across the centuries, we grant Sporus the one thing he was denied in life, his humanity.